Hey friends, it's episode 312. This week was a bit of a rushed one because I had some surprising stuff go down towards the end of it where I needed to crank out an episode really fast without a lot of preparation. So I figured I'd give you guys some more eldritch jubcore, i.e. obscure Eurodeath that only I care about. Actually, that's not entirely true because the first time this stuff got reissued, it actually was a pretty big deal. And they've always been kind of a cult classic demo level band in the underground. So I'm willing to bet if you're pretty deep into the underground death metal scene, you've probably heard of these guys once or it's the mighty Regurgitate of Stockholm, Sweden in the late 80s and early 90s. Probably most famous nowadays for being the prior band of Urban from Regurgitate, who themselves are probably most famous for having an album entitled Carnivorous Erection. Yeah, that's pretty gnarly. And I do like me some Regurgitate, but Crematory is some of the best death metal ever. Also probably some of the least stereotypically Swedish sounding Swedish death metal ever released. And one of the first uber obscure death metal bands I ever heard right around the same time that I heard Gorment and Nirvana 2002. Not that I heard the band Nirvana in the year 2002. I'm talking about the old Swedish death metal band that was originally called Prophet 2002, then changed their name to Nirvana, then found out there was another band called Nirvana way back in the 80s and changed their name to Nirvana 2002, a combination of their prior name and their new name. But that's beside the point. Crematory might be even more important nowadays than they were back when they were actually releasing material, as being something of a vanguard of the old school death metal revival movement, in that they were one of the first obscure old school death metal bands to get their stuff reissued, in this case by Necroharmonic, who also put out reissues of all the old Goraphobia demos and Gorment demos and Wombbath demos and everything way back in the early to mid 2000s. In fact, this also generated one of the first old school death metal revival controversies, in that the first pressing of the discography reissue of Crematory sounded like a long, nasty, wet and juicy fart because something went wrong with the remastering process. Luckily, they fixed it the second press of the discography reissue, and I think you'd have a hard time finding the original version. But if you want to check when you buy the Crematory discography, just make sure that the matrix number on the inside of the CD is 37032, then you're golden. That's the good sounding version. Anything else in there, you've been hornswoggled into either buying the original press that sounded like a butt, or you got some kind of wacky Russian bootleg. But speaking of checking CD matrix numbers and looking up different versions of reissues of different demo level bands, Crematory was probably my introduction to all that, as well as my introduction to really obscure old school death metal in general. They kind of trained my ear to appreciate this sort of stuff, because when you put on Crematory's most famous EP, Denial, you get one song that's like... Then the next song on the album starts out and it's like... And you're like...
Wait a minute!
That one riff sounds exactly like the other riff, just kind of turned inside out a little bit. Why am I listening to this? Is every song going to sound the same? And maybe, to the untrained ear, that would be true. But the more you listen to Crematory, the more you start realizing the different sorts of subtleties and the way that they develop their compositions, and they're really good at developing a song and take it into all sorts of different places. So even though most of those songs start out almost exactly the same, by the end of each song, they've gone to like a completely different dimension. That first song, Chunks of Flesh, probably the most famous Crematory song. It's sort of like they're breaking the law. And yeah, that opening riff is catchy as fuck. And it really does a good job of showing off Urban's weird bended, curvy sort of ripping style. But then it starts blasting way more than any other Swedish death metal at the time, to the point where I almost call them a death grind band. And it alternates between those two approaches before moving into the next section of the song, which starts out as a pretty explicit follow-up to that opening riff before they switch up the rhythms underneath it into almost this kind of punkish, kind of bouncy type stuff. Oddly catchy and energetic for early death metal, at which point they shift into more of a death doom thing almost. Same sort of melodies being played by the guitar, but the approach is much more slow and sick sounding. Before then, they use one of their trademark transition riffs, where they come in with one guitar layer and then add the second one to give this sense of epic turnaround, before then jumping into one of my favorite riffs. I feel like I don't even need to add anything to this part. Obviously, this shit is fucking amazing. If you don't like it, you're a poser.
just get lost. Rah, rah.
Then they go back into that transition sort of riff again, where you think maybe they're going to go back to that doomy riff from earlier, and it seems like that's where they're heading. And yeah, that melody comes back, but now it's played in a grindcore style with these blast-beated drums, alternated with another sort of groovy riff, kind of like how they're switching between death and grind at the beginning of the song. Then you got this like death thrash type shit right here, going into the solo, which gets really dark and moody with these melodies and the addition of a subtle little keyboard layer. You wouldn't expect something this brutal to be that atmospheric, but that's what you get from this song, which started out sounding like it was going to be pretty simple, groovy death metal. Took you on this journey through all these different subgenres of death metal and made it work as a cohesive musical organism. The song that comes after it on the EP, the title track, Denial, starts out with a similarly catchy riff, but the songwriting approach in this song is completely different. You start out with a similar sort of catchy, bendy, groovy kind of death metal riff, but then instead of immediately jumping into alternating with grindcore, they give it a very similar sounding follow-up riff to demonstrate their skills at writing melodic counterpoint. This song isn't as focused on big transitions as Chunks of Flesh was. The tempo changes still exist, but each riff that's introduced after the transition clearly follows on the riffs that happened before the transition in terms of kind of the soul of their melodies. The song almost feels like it was built by machines, but in a good way. Like it's very logical and methodical with how it explores all of its different riff themes. And speaking of sounding mechanical, check out those snare hits. The drum part here almost makes me feel like I'm trapped inside a death metal factory or something. That's not to say there's no grindcore chaos at all on this track, because they definitely still do that blasting grindcore thing. But like you heard right there, the interspersing with chunkier death metal takes place inside the riffs themselves instead of between different sections of riffs. So yeah, you had these two songs started out sounding very similar, but when you actually listen to where each song goes, they end up being completely different death metal experiences, and that's what I love about Crematory. Now, they weren't always at this level of songwriting mastery, because everything I played you was off of their 1992 EP, Denial, which was actually their fourth release. Their first demo from 1989 shows off a similar predilection for transitioning between different riff sections, but it's a lot more rough around the edges. It's also quite a bit more thrash metal influence, which makes sense because this is the only one where Urban has a co-guitarist. In this case, Mikael Lindvall from Afflicted Convulsion, a much thrashier band, who I should probably cover at some point. The weird mixture of groovy death metal sections with doom and grindcore sections still exists on this demo. It's just not really as smoothly done as it would be later on. Like right here, this is a pretty obvious grindcore section, but the way they're incorporating those groovier parts is just a hair more awkward than it would be in their classic era. Also, this part right here, right after this weird little drum section. Check it out.
I mean, there's Chuck Schuldiner's band Death. Good band, actually.
Sounds like something straight off of Scream Bloody Gore. Later on, they would become much more original. And by later on, I mean the first demo they did after Mikael left. 1990s, the Exordium. This is kind of where like the classic Crematory sound first rears its ugly head. It also has the first version of one of their classic songs, Chunks of Flesh. And I know there's a lot of people out there that prefer this version to the later version, and I can kind of see where they're coming from because the slow part on this version of the song tends to hit a lot harder than the re-recording on their 1992 EP. However, when it comes to the fast parts of the song, I gotta say I prefer quite a bit compared to the earlier I don't know. I just feel like the later version has a little bit more percussive force to it. Maybe it's because I heard the later version first. If you like the earlier version better, you know, no problem. I can see where you're coming from. Just don't get mad at me. But for me, the standout track on this demo is the title track, the Exordium. It starts out with this part that almost sounds like them doing their own version of a Slayer-style riff before then death metaling it up. And don't worry, your speakers aren't fucks. That stereo balancing error exists in the original. You know, for the first third of the song or so, you get this tasty parade of riffs before we're then immediately submerged into very dark death doom with, I believe, their first occurrence of the usage of keyboards for this band. And it is incredibly well done. You can also see how much smoother the transitions are this time around. as they take that same doom death riff but kind of play it in more of a death grind sort of way. Grindcore was always a very important part of this band's DNA, even going back to their earliest releases. And it makes sense that Urban would go on to found the grindcore band Regurgitate after they broke up. Also, this chunky part right here, particularly once the vocals kick in, reminds me a whole lot of early Mortician back before they had a drum machine. And that's always cool when that happens. Yeah, you know, more great transition riffs, an appreciable degree of old school death metal groovy bounciness to it. The 1989 Mortal Torment demo is more of a historical curiosity for Crematory fans, but I would say the Exordium, if you like what you've heard of the Denial EP from earlier in this episode, you're gonna like the Exordium, because this is where Crematory really started crafting their own unique style of death metal, which continued the following year on probably their best demo, 1991's Wrath from the Unknown. This one's got the other most well-known Crematory song, Mastication, which is the first Crematory song I ever heard, and yeah, I can see why it's one of their more popular songs. It's got that same sort of catchiness to it that Chunks of Flesh has got. But you know me, I like to go against the grain. I like to... So my favorite song on this demo is the much less recognized title track, Wrath from the Unknown. The keyboards and overall gloomy atmosphere to the Doom Death sections are back from the prior demo with quite a vengeance. In fact, this might be the darkest that Crematory ever got. It reminds me quite a bit of that other Swedish band, Eternal Decay, both with its incorporation of keyboards and also how they come out of those gloomier sections with these chugging, groove-oriented, yet sardonically melodic sort of riffs.
그러니까 엄마 아빠가 그거를 해주면 이게 하드렌즈니까.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you don't know Crematory, there's no way you're gonna know Eternal Decay. Alright, give me a second here. Alright, check it out. Eternal Decay, 1993. The album Forgotten Dream. You got this boom metal shit going on with the keyboard. Then they transition out of that stuff with this riff that is both chugging, but also has like a mocking sense of melody to it. That's what I'm talking about.
Everybody got that?
It reminds me a lot of this Crematory demo that came out a few years earlier. In fact, if Eternal Decay weren't influenced by that demo, I would be very shocked. Anyways, back to Crematory, with another one of their patented great transition riffs leading back into that mocking, sort of chugged out guitar melody I was talking about earlier, and a more punkish, primitive variant on it when they switch up the drums underneath it to be in more of a D-beat style construction, which was always very important for this entire era of Swedish death metal. But what that leads us into is a recapitulation of that doomy melodic riff from the beginning, this time serving as the backing track for my personal favorite lead guitar moment in the entire Crematory discography, with this cyclical, soulful outpouring of guitar solo melody. That's why Wrath from the Unknown is my favorite Crematory song on this demo. It just does a lot of cool stuff like that. Speaking of a lot of cool stuff, after they put out their only official release, 92's Denial EP that we started the episode out with, they put out another demo. This one entitled Netherworlds of the Mind, and wouldn't you know, it's also fantastic. It's them at their most seamless and smooth in terms of them combining those very chunky riffs with more of a blasting grindcore type thing, with both styles coexisting simultaneously inside individual riffs, like what you're hearing right now. This riff gets stuck in my head all the time. Absolutely fantastic death metal. And this demo's got plenty of those great Crematory transition sections as well. This one in particular leads into more of a churning section that shows off that they've kind of abandoned the more cavern core sound of their demos in favor of a sharper edge sound reminiscent of their 92 EP. They also brought back those awesome keyboard parts that have always been a cool part of their sound. In addition, we have the return of Urban's very distinctive style of guitar soloing. It's not, Ralph Santola or Dave Suzuki style melodicism, but it's not Kerry King, Rick Ross style whammy bar bass either. It's like a melodic guitar soloing written in the language of death metal, if that makes sense. Whatever it is, I like it. I like this demo a lot, and it's a shame it's the last thing they put out. But while I was listening to this demo and reading through the rather extensive liner notes on my discography reissue, I noticed something kind of funny at the end of the entry for Netherworlds of the Mind. In all caps it says, "And don't ever confuse them with the German band with the same name, 4 exclamation points." That part always kind of intrigued me due to its vociferousness. Like, I always wonder what's going on with this German band, also called Crematory, that's got the other Crematory so riled up. So I went and checked them out, and yikes, dude. Mallcore Central Station. Dude out here looking like an undercooked David Draymond.
I can see inside you, my Venus is rising. Don't try to deny that I'm gay.
Yeah, how about we leave the symphonic goth metal thing to people that can actually do it properly, like Moi de Moi, and we leave the Crematory band name to the great death metal band from Sweden in the late 80s and early 90s that sadly were pretty much done after that 1992 demo.
Or were they?
Because here's the thing about Crematory. Most of the guys in this band went on to start the grindcore band Regurgitate. And most Regurgitate, you know, it kind of sounds like a more gore-obsessed version of Nazem or something. You know, pretty decent modern death grind type stuff. And in fact, Urban ended up joining Nazem for their final album. But that first Regurgitate album came out only a couple years after that last Crematory demo. Is a completely different beast. For starters, it's way more punk sounding and way more old school sounding. Like, check out that obvious D beat, check out that super fucking loud bass in the intro to the song, check out those old school style chug riffs leading us through a very smooth transition section into total blasting grindcore chaos. Okay, this is what I like my old school gore grind to sound like. Fantastic stuff. But the more you listen to this album, particularly during the longer songs, you start to notice something interesting. It's not just your standard carcass worship going on here. I mean, check out the intro riff to the fourth song on the album, Flesh Feast.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. That sounds a lot like a Crematory riff, just kind of repurposed and made into more of a gore grind mold. Now, some people out there might counter this argument by saying, hey, Carcass had a lot of weird chuggy riffs like that back in the day. But I don't know, man. This isn't an isolated instance. Quite a lot of this album sounds like a hidden Crematory full-length to me, which is undoubtedly why it is my favorite Regurgitate album. It's because it's got that same classic Crematory riff and style, dude. And that makes sense because literally everybody in Regurgitate at this point, and only on this album from them, was in Crematory. It's literally the Crematory line that except with a new, more grindcore kind of vocal. Where you're hearing these bouncy, groovy riffs, man, that is totally something that could have shown up on a Crematory album. And it makes sense. If you remember, I was pointing out all those more grindcore styled parts on old Crematory. You can do the same thing in reverse with the first Regurgitate album. Point out the more chunky death metal style riffs that coexist alongside the blasting grindcore. So I feel like if you were into old Crematory, you could probably find a lot to like on this first Regurgitate album. And hey, if you're a fan of that first Regurgitate album, you haven't ever heard the old Crematory demos, I would recommend giving them a chance because it's got a very similar riffing style. Because it's the same fucking dudes doing it. Whatever, you should probably go out and get all of this stuff because Crematory and early Regurgitate were some of the best that Swedish death metal or Swedish gore grind, whatever you want to call it, had to offer back in the 90s. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about them. Thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
약간 V가 제가 습관인 것 같아요. 이런 거 너무 좋게.